We're giving this talk today to mobilize people to join a rebellion, a movement of people who are taking direct action to address the climate and ecological emergency. And now I'm going to share my screen. So what you're going to see from now on is the slides of the talk. So welcome to Heading for Extinction and What to Do About It. Thank you for coming here today. We're going together to face the truth about the climate and ecological crisis. It takes some courage to face up to this truth. Understanding the extent of this crisis can have a powerful impact and bring up lots of different thoughts and feelings. So during this talk, you may find, certainly during the first part is quite demanding. And it's good that we're here together, and we're going to have a brief break in the middle to try and just gather ourselves together and share a little bit about how we feel about the first part of the talk. I would like to say, please don't, if you feel you've had enough halfway through and want to leave, it's probably not the best idea to leave halfway through, because the second half of the talk helps to sort of take in the information on the first part and think about how we can deal with it. So if you stay for the first half, it's good to stay for the whole thing. Right. Now, one more thing just before I get into the material. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the situation we find ourselves in at the moment. I last gave this talk in the Quaker Meeting Hall in Hartford on the 13th of February to an audience of about 40 people who came there in person. It isn't really that long ago, but it feels like another world. Since then, everything has, of course, changed. And we're now doing this talk remotely because we're in lockdown. So in the last couple of months, coronavirus has taken center stage in everything. And so inevitably, this talk, which is about the dangers we're facing from climate change and biodiversity loss, and what we as members of the public can do about it, is going to be coloured by the fact that our focus of attention has been so dramatically shifted. However, it's unfortunately true that however shockingly and suddenly coronavirus has disrupted our lives and captured our attention, the threat from climate change and the biodiversity crisis that we're facing remains real and urgent. And we just can't afford to put it aside during this time, as it's too pressing and urgent a problem. So therefore, we've decided to present this talk again. And I'm going to be just alluding from time to time to the coronavirus pandemic on the way through, just to see if it has any lessons that we can apply to the climate change problem. So I'm going to start with a very brief note about Extinction Rebellion, which we will be talking about a good deal more later. Extinction Rebellion is a group of people concerned enough about the climate and ecological emergency we're facing to do something about it. Extinction Rebellion is a non-violent, direct action, civil protest organization. And what that means in practice will become clear during this talk. XR is now active both throughout the UK and worldwide. We're an organization largely made up of ordinary people, ordinary, law-abiding, tax-paying types of people. I, for example, I'm neither a climate scientist nor any kind of scientist, nor am I any kind of veteran protester. I'm a psychotherapist, although currently not working as one. And in Extinction Rebellion, you'll find all kinds of people: doctors, shop workers, lawyers, office workers, business people, builders, teachers, cleaners, you name it. If you pull someone at random off the streets, there's a reasonable chance they might be in Extinction Rebellion. So we're normal citizens, not particularly rebellious by nature. Rebellion is an uncomfortable word for me, but we use it deliberately. We aim to elicit government action on the climate and ecological crisis. We've decided to rebel because we feel that the situation we're in with our climate and species loss is so serious and dangerous for our future as human beings that this kind of disruptive and rebellious action is necessary to address it. So this talk is divided into two parts. The first part concerns the climate and ecological crisis. We have a look at the basic science and a look at the prospects for the future if we don't take action. And the second part is what we need to do, looking at Extinction Rebellion and the plan that we have and how we think it might work. So let's first of all look at the crisis we face and the truth about it. So here we have the Earth, a picture of the Earth on which we live. This Earth is our only life support system. We've only got one Earth. There's no planet B, as some people put it. Our Earth is all we have for us, for our lives and our children's lives, and the future of our species. Everything that we need for survival is contained on the surface of the planet, in the air and the biosphere, the oceans and the land that supports us. And the frightening truth is that we are in the process of destroying it. We're in the process of destroying it. We're destroying it, broadly speaking, in two different ways. We're destroying its climate. We're heating up the Earth so that we're fundamentally altering the delicate balance, the delicate climate balance that we've enjoyed for several thousand years. And we're destroying its ecology. The biosphere on which we depend is becoming severely damaged by our activities. And putting those two things together, we're destroying our future. Carrying on with business as usual, if we do that, we're really looking at the end, firstly, of human civilization as we know it, and secondly, if we take things too far, at the end of the human species itself. So we are literally looking at the prospect of extinction. And we are the first and only species in the 4 billion year history of life on this planet that has ever understood the risk of its imminent extinction. So if any species can stop its own extinction, it's us. And the question is, will we? Or at least will we take all possible steps to do so? So first of all, let's look at our climate. Forgive me if you're already familiar with this material. I'm presenting it in its most basic form, but I think it does no harm to go through it again. Let's talk about greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases keep Earth warm. So you can see there that when energy from the sun comes towards the Earth, most of it is reflected back, and it tries to radiate away. It bounces back out again, if you like. However, the Earth's atmosphere contains greenhouse gases, and these are gases whose molecular structure is such that they trap heat. So some of the heat that's trying to radiate away, to bounce back, instead gets absorbed by these greenhouse gases and remains within our atmosphere. And the greenhouse gases that are of most importance to us are carbon dioxide, CO2, and methane, and also water vapor. Now, the levels of carbon dioxide and methane in the atmosphere regulate to quite a high level of precision how warm the climate is. So over the multiple millions of years that the Earth has existed, the atmosphere has gained and lost carbon dioxide. And paleoclimatologists have found that the climate has heated and cooled pretty much in sync with those changes. So the amount of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere is a very potent regulator of our climate. And we've known for about 200 years or so that an increase in the level of these gases in the atmosphere will in theory cause warming of the Earth. And it has, in fact, turned out exactly like that. So greenhouse gases are the reason why Earth is not currently a ball of ice. They are extremely important. Carbon dioxide is a good gas. It's not harmful in itself. It's vital and important. But in excess, it becomes problematic. And we have been pumping these greenhouse gases into our atmosphere at a completely unprecedented rate, and the Earth is getting warmer. So when the Industrial Revolution began, about 200 years ago, in the early 19th century, we discovered that there were vast underground reserves of fossil fuels, oil, coal, natural gas, these carbon-based products of earlier living things which have been buried beneath the surface of the Earth. And in their structure, they contain a huge amount of energy. And we've extracted and exploited that energy to build our industrial civilization and to create the very comfortable lives that most of us enjoy right now. But in the process of burning those fossil fuels for our energy, we've relentlessly pumped vast quantities of carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere, thus causing more and more of the sun's heat to be absorbed by these gases and retained within our atmosphere, rather than escaping into space. And so the Earth is getting very slowly hotter and hotter and hotter. Here's a graph for you. This graph is known as the hockey stick curve. And it's a visual demonstration of the extreme rate at which this has been happening. So you will see, this goes back 2,000 years, and you will see, looking at that red line, that for most of that time, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was stable at around 280 parts per million. And that's been regulated by the activities of living things, ourselves pumping carbon dioxide into the air, trees and plants sucking it out again. It's stayed at a consistent level. Then where you see that blue arrow coming down over on the right of the graph, at the beginning of the 19th century, you will see that the graph starts to go up. And it goes up fairly slowly and consistently. And then after the Second World War, what is known as the Great Acceleration began, and our industrial industries really took off. And the graph started to rise steeply, and particularly within the last 30 to 40 years, it has just skyrocketed. So we have a rapidly escalating level of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And you'll see now on the graph, it looks like about 400, and I think the latest figure is about 417, up from that 280. And it's reckoned that 350 parts per million is a safe amount. So we're well over that. And this is a graph of the Earth's temperatures, how they've changed over, and that, again, that starts, you see on the left, is about the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And there are two lines, two wavy lines on there. One is the temperature over land, and the other is the temperature over the oceans. They show the temperature rises in degrees centigrade over a baseline of pre-industrial levels before about 1850. So when we talk about, for example, a 1.5 degree rise, which you hear a lot, this means the temperature rise over the baseline levels of the pre-industrial era. So you can see that the temperature over the oceans, which rises more slowly, has gone up around about 1 degree, and the temperature over land has gone up much more quickly. So we are now at about 1.1 degrees average above pre-industrial levels of temperature, and it's risen in sync with the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere Here's another visual demonstration of it, just showing how the temperature has changed over the years 1850 to 2017. Okay, now it's not like we haven't known about this. In around the 1980s, scientists started to convince politicians that the changing climate was actually something to be concerned about. And around that time, the late 70s, early 80s, various scientists were coming out with forecasts of what might happen because of this problem. And some of them were cautious, saying that there's going to be a problem. Some of them were fairly crazy, really. And this organization, the IPCC, the governments of the world got together, and through the United Nations, they formed a body called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, known as the IPCC. And the function of this body is to gather together all the scientific literature on climate from all over the world. It's made up of scientists and experts in all sorts of different domains, mainly climate scientists. They review thousands and thousands and thousands of scientific papers on climate, and they meet up periodically, and every few years they produce a report. And so because of the variation in individual scientists' report in the 70s and 80s, the IPCC organization was formed to try and bring consistency and coherency to these reports. And they have consistently started to warn us about the dangers of climate change. And one of their most recent reports was in October 2018, not long after we'd had that spectacularly hot summer that you might remember. And this 2018 report was very sobering. Since the Paris Agreement of 2015, the aim had been to try and limit the temperature rises that we were just looking at to a maximum of 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And then in late 2018 came this seminal report that said in order to attain this 1.5 degree target, if we're going to have any chance of limiting the temperature rises to 1.5 degrees, we have to start taking drastic action now. And that was in 2018. And they said we only have 12 years to make rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented changes to all aspects of society. I'm just going to repeat that. Rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented changes to all aspects of society before we run the risk of tipping points being reached that would make climate change irreversible. So we're looking at the possibility that we might push the system too far out of equilibrium, and then we can't stop it. The changes will accelerate and carry on under their own steam. So this IPCC report was a real call to action, and a lot of people were alarmed by it, and it really woke people up. And it was one of the things that got me involved in Extinction Rebellion, and many other people too. I'm just going to pause here for a moment in the light of what I've just said and think for a minute about coronavirus, because that's where we are at the moment. With regard for coronavirus, were we prepared and ready? No, I think we have to say we weren't prepared, we weren't ready. We didn't know it was coming, although to some extent we did, because experts had been warning about the dangers of another pandemic. World leaders had been warning for a while. And I just wonder, with climate change, are we making the due preparations for the ravages of climate change, which we know is coming? And that means in this context, are we making rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented changes to all aspects of society? Well, we are starting to think about it. We're starting to do bits and pieces here and there. Perhaps coronavirus is going to help us to bring those things into being, but whatever, we need to move much, much faster. And skip this slide. And so let's go back and look for a minute at, there's one question people sometimes say, and they say, well, the Earth has had several warm periods in the past when temperatures are way higher than they are now. What's the big fuss? We'll manage. And it's true that there have been warm periods in the past. However, these warm periods have not been while human civilization has been around. And this diagram you can see here is a graph of the last 500 million years of temperatures, which is roughly the period of time over which we've had large and complex life forms on Earth. And as you can see, looking at those, the lines there, we've had some warm periods and some substantial temperature variations. So the green line across the middle is the average temperature between 1960 and 1990. And you can see that for the last 12,000 years or so, over on the far right of the graph, where you've got that sort of straight, level sort of spiky line, we've had a very stable climate, and that's known as the Holocene. We've been in the Holocene era, where we've had this very stable climate. The temperature has been temperate, we've had ice at the poles, we've had heat at the tropics, but most of the Earth is inhabitable and stable. So we've been able to develop agriculture, we've been able to develop cities, and we've been able to spread out and cover the surface of the Earth with our habitations. And the last time that temperatures were 1.5 or 2 degrees higher than they are now, was 130,000 years ago. You can see that blue spike where it says Eemian, long before human civilization. And then the last time before that it was more than 2 degrees or 3 or 4 degrees higher was many, many millions of years ago, before humans even evolved. So the conclusion to that is that human civilization has not existed in a warm Earth, and we don't know if it can. That's the big unknown. We're pushing ourselves out of the Holocene into uncharted territory, and we don't know what we're messing with. Now, we're already at 1.1 degrees above the pre-industrial baseline, and we're starting to feel a lot of the effects of climate change already. So let's have a look at one or two examples of what has taken place globally. And we're just looking at devastating weather events of the last few years. This, at the top left here, there's a picture of the floods that took place in Queensland. This is before the fires, early last year, 2019, and they ended a very long drought with a number of very intense rainfall events that caused widespread flooding and killed 500,000 cattle. The top right is a picture of Chennai, a city in India where the city ran out of water. Chennai is a modern city in India. It's only a little smaller than London, several million people. And it ran out of water. Water had to be delivered by tanker to meet the needs of its inhabitants. On the bottom left, you've got Paradise, California. And in November 2018, the wildfires that were raging in California at that time swept through this town of 26,000 people and completely destroyed it. Killed 85 people, drove everybody there from their homes, as well as damaging, obviously, a very large part of the surrounding area. And at the bottom right is Cyclone Idai, which struck Mozambique quite recently and forced millions of people from their homes, as well as killing many hundreds of people. So these are examples of extreme weather events that have taken place across the world. And this talk was actually put together before the Australian fires that took place at the beginning of this year, which I'm sure, even with coronavirus, are really fresh in our memory, and the horrendous destruction and some loss of life that took place because of those fires. And that tells its own tragic story. And so it's clear that we're already starting to feel the effects of the heating climate globally. So even here in the UK, where at the moment we are not suffering the worst effects of climate change, we've started to feel some impacts. And this century, we're starting to get more extreme weather events. For example, there was a heat wave in 2003, which spread right across Europe, affected the UK as well. It's been implicated in the deaths of around 70,000 people. In 2014, you may remember, we had the worst rainfall in 248 years, which caused catastrophic flooding across the country, and unusually, I think, affected the south of England worse than the north of England. There's a village in Wales called Fairbourne, which is the first, which has been, because of rising sea levels, they have decided it has to be abandoned because it's not going to be possible to protect it. So by 2040, the whole village has to be abandoned and has to be moved about a mile inland. That's the first actual village that's the casualty of climate change in that particular way. In 2018, we had the hottest summer on record in the UK. Record numbers of people went to accident and emergency, not just with heat exhaustion, but with strokes, heart attacks, and all of the things that people normally die of, but in increased numbers because of the stress of day after day of unrelenting heat. And of course, we had the floods this year, not that long ago, in the north of England, and I'm sure there are many people who are still in the process of trying to recover from that. So we are here being affected by climate change, not yet catastrophically, unless you're some unfortunate person whose house has been flooded, but it's coming to us too. So what happens if we carry on heating up the earth and don't take any action? This is known as the business as usual scenario, where we just carry on doing what we're doing. We're going to see various things. We're going to see accelerating sea level rise due to melting ice and thermal expansion, coastal flooding and storm surges. We're going to see stronger atmospheric weather systems with storms, droughts, wildfires, desertification and crop failure. We're going to see deaths due to heat stress. We're going to see, as a result of these things, most likely famine, water shortages, displacement of people from their homes. These things, of course, are already going on. And the great risk is that the end result of this kind of destabilization is inevitably, as history has shown us many times, armed conflict. And this is in a planet where we now have nuclear arms. So the consequences for business as usual are not good. And just thinking about that word famine for a brief moment, coronavirus has given us a stark reminder of the vulnerability of our supply chains in the face of a sudden and relatively unexpected threat. We saw panic buying, as we know, just recently, and suddenly things that we thought were staples, well, are staples, and we had come to take for granted as the basics of life, pasta, toilet rolls, bread flour, and quite a few other things, were for a short while completely unobtainable. So we've just had a little glimpse into how vulnerable our supply chains are to disruption. So we're very near to the end of this section on climate change. What we've been talking about so far is a gradual rise in temperatures caused by increasing greenhouse gases. And there's a danger that there are other effects that may cause the rise to suddenly accelerate. And these things are known as positive feedback loops to do with the effects. And one of them is about the Arctic ice. There's quite a lot of ice still at the poles. We're melting it rapidly, but there is still quite a good deal, and it cools the Earth quite considerably. When sunlight hits that white ice, it reflects back out, much like a mirror, and some of it gets back into space. But as the Earth starts to heat up and we shrink the ice caps and the ice is replaced by dark water, the water absorbs that heat, much like a solar panel, instead of reflecting it. And that in turn accelerates the rate of ice loss. This is a feedback loop called the albedo effect. And this creates a very local, very rapid local increase in warming. And the poles are in fact warming much faster than any other parts of the planet to an extraordinary level. And we've been seeing temperatures are as much as 30 degrees higher than they should be for this time of year in the Arctic, for example. Another example of a positive feedback loop is that it has been discovered that under the permafrost in places like Siberia, as well as under the sea ice at the poles, there are vast pockets of methane gas, that very potent greenhouse gas. And the danger is here that as the permafrost starts to melt in places like Siberia and Alaska, that methane will be released. And that in turn will increase the rate of melting of the permafrost. And so another feedback loop begins to operate. So climate change is happening. It's still accelerating, and these things could amplify the effects of climate change still more. So that's the end of our section on climate change. I'm just going to reflect once more on coronavirus. You may be saying to yourselves, hasn't the coronavirus emergency led to a drop in carbon emissions? Very few planes flying, many less cars on the road. And the answer is yes, it has. It's clearly the levels are going to be dropping this year quite dramatically, which is a good thing. But what will we learn from that? Will this just be a blip in the ongoing scenario of ever increasing emissions as business as usual bounces back? Or will we be able to move from here into a genuine transition towards a zero carbon future? And I think this is going to be the key question as the world starts to move out of lockdown. So that was climate, which is only half of the problem. The other part of our problem is the biosphere, the ecology of our planet, the complex and fragile system of life that sustains us. This life is in the land, we have both land and ocean ecosystems. And again, we're in the process of destroying both with our industrialization. So firstly, we'll look at the land. Earth, we used to have large areas of wilderness on the earth, but high intensity agriculture has replaced that wilderness. Land has been and is being rapidly converted from wilderness and forest to high intensity agriculture. The two big drivers of this land use are, first of all, the need to grow enough food just to support us 7.5 billion humans. That 7.5 billion is rising rapidly. So by 2050, it's predicted there may be 10 billion of us at the current rate of increase. And the second factor is our increasing demand for a high meat and dairy diet. especially in newly developed countries such as China. And in that context, livestock populations, the animals that we keep in order to supply us with meat, are rising twice as fast as human populations. So in order to feed that many humans, we've had to deploy all of our resources. So we've deforested huge amounts of land and replaced it with farmland. Agriculture uses a great deal of land that would otherwise be forests or natural grassland, and water that would otherwise sustain river ecologies. Much of our agriculture produces meat, which consumes a lot more land to produce animal feed than crops do. And meat production also produces a lot of carbon emissions, notably methane produced from cattle as they digest grass. And the United Nations has estimated that 14.5% of human-caused carbon emissions comes from livestock. And the final, well, another problem with this is the need for pesticides to sustain these monocultures. We have to eradicate pests in order that these crops will grow. And thus we've destroyed much of the insect life that normally inhabits the earth. Intensive agriculture requires pesticides to keep insects at bay and prevent them from destroying crops. However, pesticides have caused a catastrophic decline of insects worldwide, which may need to lead to the extinction of 40% of the world's insect species over the next few decades. If we lose insects at that kind of rate and on that kind of scale, we will be having unpredictable effects on our food chain and on the whole web of life. Deforestation, which of course is part of the destruction of wilderness. We deforest vast areas in order to convert them into cattle grazing and crop growing land. Deforestation is reducing carbon drawdown. Forests are very intense carbon sinks. They help to draw carbon out of the atmosphere and turn it into plant material. When we burn them, obviously we take away their capacity to do that. When we destroy forest and replace it with crops, we are essentially replacing a very biodiverse system with a monoculture, which is very poor in its biodiversity. And biodiversity, the vast range of different species we have on our planet, really, really matters, because in the web of life, everything depends on everything else. And if we lose one species to extinction, it has unknown and unpredictable effects right the way through, especially from our point of view, to the food chain. And trees also metabolize and send out water and maintain a moist climate. And you lose that when you cut them down or burn them. So forests are very healthy for the planet and their loss is dangerous. And the end result of this process can be desertification. We create a desert, and that is almost impossible to reverse and turn back into anything that's very useful for life. Deserts have very low capacity to sustain life. So that's the land. Secondly, the oceans. The oceans are equally important to our survival. They're a carbon sink. They supply much of our food. And we are, of course, with climate change, we're heating up the ocean slowly. And that does a number of things. It reduces dissolved oxygen. As the water slowly heats, it loses its ability to hold as much oxygen. It increases the acidity of the ocean, and that affects the ability of things like shellfish to form their shells, and has bad effects on ocean life. It kills ecosystems, and that causes big changes in the distribution of marine life. So the cod, for example, have to migrate northwards because they can no longer survive in the warmer, less oxygenated waters. Phytoplankton, which is a tiny organism, really, really important, which lives in the sea and is also absorbs a lot of carbon dioxide. Their life is disturbed by ocean heating. And of ocean currents, because ocean currents depend on temperature changes, mainly between the ice caps and the tropics. When those temperature differentials change, it changes ocean currents, again with unpredictable effects on the climate. And finally, of course, as we know, heating causes melting ice caps, which raises sea levels. So this is the effects we're having on the ocean and the land. And putting these things together, we have begun, it would appear, the Earth's sixth mass extinction. If we look at the history of life on Earth over billions of years, scientific discoveries have taught us that there have been 5 major events that have destroyed a large percentage of living creatures. These are known as mass extinctions. Most of them were due to changes in climate of one sort or another. And we seem to be at the beginning of the 6th one of those. Now, there are ongoing natural extinction processes. In normal circumstances, about 10 species per year can expect to become extinct. But estimates are that current extinction processes are taking place 100 to 1,000 times faster than normal rates. It's been reported recently by the United Nations that we threaten up to 1 million species a year with extinction. Sorry, 1 million species with extinction. So we're producing large changes in the distribution of life on Earth with unknown but deadly possibilities. Most mammalian biomass, in other words, the total weight of all animals, including ourselves by weight, is no longer wild. This is an extraordinary statistic. Around 10,000 years ago, 99% of all mammals by weight on Earth were wild animals and 1% were humans. Today, we have a mere 4% wild animals, 60% livestock, food for our consumption, and 36% humans. Think of the huge change that represents. And one more thought on coronavirus. Many scientists at the moment are coming out and pointing out a likely connection between diseases like coronavirus and this extraordinary pressure that we're subjecting the natural world to. Most likely because of the pressure of humanity on biodiversity generally, and including such things as illegal wildlife markets, this virus has found it necessary to try and find a home in new populations, i.e. us. This isn't a scientifically proven link, but nonetheless, highly distinguished scientists are starting to make it. And it's very much worth considering in the light of the crisis we're looking at. So we're very nearly finished this first part. We inherited a world of richness that our descendants may not get to enjoy, just thinking for a moment about future generations. Our children are starting to experience a much reduced world in which natural unspoilt landscapes are rare, wild animals and insects are becoming harder to find, and most life is lived in separation from nature. Our grandchildren may never know the animals we take for granted, like lions, tigers, giraffes, and elephants. More shockingly, they may not know bees, butterflies, frogs, and lizards. We're stripping the planet of its life, and once it's gone, we can't get it back. We're turning it into an impoverished and infertile planet. And by destroying our food web, we're destroying our own futures. we're destroying the very things that keep us alive. So these things we briefly looked at, climate breakdown and ecological collapse, are imperiling our own future well-being and indeed existence, and more especially those of future generations. So that's the end of the section on the climate and ecological crisis. And we're just going to take a few minutes now. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, come back in. And I'd just like to take a brief moment. I'm well aware that this is very, very heavy, very demanding, very difficult information that you've been listening to. And I'm just going to suggest just for a moment that we pause, just if we're sitting in a chair or whatever we're doing. If we're sitting in a chair, I suggest you just shut your eyes, let your hands rest on your lap, feel your feet on the floor, and just take a few slow, deep breaths. And let's just come back to ourselves. So I'll just have a moment of silence while we do that. Okay, let's just reflect just for a moment on how we're feeling after that presentation. And then I'm going to try and unmute everybody. And I'm going to suggest that one or two of us just say one word or phrase that expresses how we're feeling. You could be feeling angry. You could be feeling frightened. You could be feeling numb or shocked. You could be feeling indifferent. So just for a second, I'm going to unmute us all. And if anyone would like to, just say one word out loud as to how you're feeling after that information that I've given you. So just shout out a word.
Depressed,
John.
Depressed, yeah.
Bleak.
Grief.
I've heard depressed. I heard one other word, but I couldn't quite hear what it was.
Grief.
Grief, thank you. Shocked. Yeah.
I'd like to say again, second time I've seen it, shocked again.
Shocked again. Thank you, Alan.
Depleted.
Okay. Sorry?
Depleted.
Depleted. Thank you. So that information has left us feeling various things and very, very hard to hear. I'm going to mute us all again now. Yeah, so very hard to hear. And you probably want to talk with whoever you're with, or give someone a call afterwards, or join us and join one of our groups that we will talk about this in. But let's just take a couple of minutes. If you want to go get a drink, go to the loo, just sit and think. And we'll come back. It's now just after 8 o'clock. We'll come back 3 minutes past 8. And we'll resume when Kate is going to talk to us about what we can do And this is the good part, really. This is where we can start to get a hold of this information and start to think, what can I do? What can we do to address this? So 3 minutes, come back, and I'll hand over to Kate, who will take us through the second part of our talk.
Way forward. From this moment, despair ends and tactics begin. So let us first look at why we should act. We need to overcome collective denial of the ecological crisis. The problem is that as a society, we have been in denial of the climate and ecological crisis since at least the 1980s. We know, and we have known, that there's been a problem with greenhouse gases, deforestation, and so on. But at the same time, we have not been able to connect our knowledge and our actions. That means that although we have known about it, we have not done nearly enough about it, and we need to do something about it. The way to overcome this denial is to confront the reality of what's going on. And that's quite a difficult process to undertake at an emotional level. We have looked at the scientific reasons why we're heading for a very difficult future. The question is, for us, here and now, why should we care, and how much should we care about that future? Here are some reasons why perhaps we should. As moral beings, we have obligations to other human beings. In the context of the ecological crisis, this is sometimes called ecological justice or climate justice. We in the developed world have largely driven the industrialisation that's causing climate change. The people who are experiencing the worst effects and the earliest effects are primarily in the not yet industrialised parts of the world. We, the wealthy, have inflicted this suffering on the less wealthy. Simple justice tells us that that is wrong. Similarly, we who have inherited the rich world are presenting future generations with a world that we have depleted. We are depriving future generations of well-being and bequeathing to them an inhospitable world with scarce and depreciated resources. This is another terrible injustice. Thirdly, we have obligations to ourselves. Fundamental to all justice systems is the right that people have to self-defense, to preserve our own life. We have the right to rebel in self-protection. So when we're looking at how we should act as moral beings and whether we should, for example, break laws, we need to bear in mind that we have a right to protect ourselves. And many of us think that we also have a moral obligation to the other living things that we share the planet with. It is not purely ours to enjoy. We are not masters of the planet. We are just another species. But because we are the most intelligent species, we have the ability to think about what we do and decide whether it's right or wrong. To treat other living creatures merely as resources that we can dispose of as we see fit is not acting in accordance with the responsibility that comes with this intelligence. So when you look at it like this, the question becomes not why should we bother to do something? Why should we fix this problem? It's a big problem. But really, how can we not fix it? How can a thinking, reasoning, moral human being not do something? So what have we tried to do already? I'm afraid now we have to do a little bit more clearing away of false hope before we can move on, because of course many things have been tried. Let us have a quick look at the efforts that have been made over the last 30 years or so. Globally, governments have, at least on the surface, been trying really hard to do things. Since the 1980s, when the public first became aware of this greenhouse effect and the problems it caused, governments have got together many times to discuss climate change under the auspices of the United Nations and the IPCC. We have had, among others, the Earth Summit of 1992 in Rio, the Kyoto Protocol of 1997, and most recently the Paris Agreement of 2015. Each has been a substantial and amazing agreement in its own way, and each has been heralded at the time as an amazing breakthrough. Each time there was that at last feeling, something has been achieved that will set us on a road to climate salvation. And you are probably aware that the next one of these meetings, COP26, will now be held in Glasgow next year. And yet, remember the hockey stick curve. Carbon emissions have continued to rise relentlessly without even pausing for breath. I'm going to pause here to note again what John mentioned in relation to the coronavirus epidemic reducing emissions, and we'll talk about this again in more detail later. So what else has been tried? On a national level, until very recently, there has been very little interest politically. The 2008 Climate Change Act, which committed us to 80% carbon neutrality by 2015, and which was improved by Theresa May to aim for complete carbon neutrality by that date, was a major achievement. But politicians say they support the Climate Change Act, but have also scrapped renewable energy schemes, given the go-ahead to fracking in communities that voted against it, although that is now under a moratorium, approved the go-ahead for Britain's largest gas-fired power station against the advice of its own advisors, approved HS2, despite it having, in the words of Greenpeace, the dubious honour of being the century's largest destroyer of ancient woodlands in the UK, and the government's own calculations suggesting that its carbon emissions could exceed potential savings, even over the railway's projected 120-year lifetime. And most recently, bailed out EasyJet with a £600 million corporate finance facility issued on pre-COVID-19 commercial rates. In 2018, the UK government's Climate Change Committee demonstrated that the UK was not on target to meet 2 degrees C climate targets, which at the time were thought to be sufficient to avoid the worst consequences of global warming. We've also tried many legal challenges to governments, and yet these have had little effect. Since 1990, more than 1,300 legal actions concerning climate damage around emissions, fracking, etc., have been brought against governments in 28 countries. Most recently, Greta Thunberg and 15 other children have lodged a legal case against Argentina, Brazil, France, Germany, and Turkey. They allege that the countries, which are legally obliged to protect children under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, breach these obligations by failing to protect them from the direct, imminent, and foreseeable risk to their health and well-being posed by the climate crisis. Last week, it was announced that Brazil, France, and Germany have responded, saying that the case should be inadmissible. Clearly, there are also a lot of environmental organisations who have been doing campaigning for many years, doing great work, but it hasn't been enough to keep the topic in the news and in the minds of politicians. No one talks about Greenpeace scaling the Shard anymore, even though they successfully delivered their Save the Arctic message. One-off marches are not enough. The government can just ignore them, as they did with the Iraq War. These efforts are to be applauded, but they're not enough. Society has not taken the action required. And finally, encouragement to individual actions. We've also encouraged people on an individual level to make changes. The problem is that, certainly until recently, the environment hasn't been number one on people's agenda. Our society rewards short-termism and individualism, which often leads to globe-trotting and consumerism, and it's not fair to expect individual people to be able to reject that in the face of such pressure. Ultimately, it's too hard to persuade enough individuals to make changes quickly enough for this to be a viable route. And that's definitely not to diminish the value of the individual changes, which I'm sure you all can and are making. Obviously, individual actions such as dietary changes, reducing driving and recycling are good, and it is good to pursue them for our own awareness, our own health, to improve our own lifestyles, and to become more sensitive to the planet on which we live, and to prepare for the future that we hopefully have. But encouragement to individual action is nowhere near enough and can have a dangerously counterproductive effect, as people can feel as though they are taking action by following advice to recycle, for example, and therefore have even greater difficulty understanding that this is having very little, if any, effect on emissions overall. So none of these approaches have worked. Once again, consider the hockey stick graph. You can see where the IPCC was formed in 1990. We've not even flattened the curve. It continues relentlessly to rise. We have had, with all this past activity, and all of these past panels and commissions, international agreements, acts of parliament, court cases, recycling initiatives, etc., not even the slightest effect on carbon dioxide and methane levels in the atmosphere. and fossil fuel use continues to skyrocket. So why hasn't it worked? Well, the reason is that there are some fundamental structural problems with how we run society that are getting in the way of being able to make headway on this problem. One, paradoxically, is the nature of modern indirect democracy. Democracy in this form requires that every few years the government go back to the people and say, will you vote us back in or not? That means that in order to win votes, they need to please people in the here and now. So governments worry that if they say to people, we're going to do something that's going to cause economic pain for the next 10 years or 20 years because of something that is causing a problem that isn't immediately obvious at the moment, then they won't be voted back in, and quite possibly their successors will reverse the policy. And they know that, and so they feel their hands are tied with what they are able to do. The second problem is capitalism. Capitalism has helped us to the great prosperity we now enjoy, and has lifted many in the world out of poverty. So capitalism has had value for the world in many ways. But in environmental terms, it is disastrous, particularly in its current unregulated free market form, known as neoliberal capitalism. Its fatal flaw regarding the environment is that it's based on a model of endless economic growth that simply doesn't recognise that we live on a finite planet with limits on what can be done on it and to it. So capitalism is not looking at the damage that is being done, and it is not costing the future for our children and grandchildren. In addition, it isn't necessarily what the majority of people want. A recent YouGov poll found 8 out of 10 people would prefer the government to prioritise health and well-being over economic growth during the coronavirus crisis, and 6 in 10 would still want the government to pursue health and well-being ahead of growth after the pandemic has subsided. As we have seen, we need collective global action. If we do not act collectively, individual action is useless, not for the individual, but for the planet. So we need a new approach. Introducing Extinction Rebellion. XR is an organisation that popped up seemingly out of nowhere. It came to public notice at the end of 2018, shortly after the very hot summer we had just had, and shortly after the IPCC report that had just said we needed, as John mentioned, rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society, and that the following 12 years were crucial to making those changes. XR had their first formative public meeting on the 31st of October 2018 and hit the headlines with a protest in November 2018 in which they blocked several of the major bridges in London. This reached the attention of many people. They seemed to be offering something that nobody else was offering in terms of climate action. And so a lot of people became very interested in what they were doing, and the movement grew rapidly. Extinction Rebellion is now a global movement. The organisation has spread all over the world. Every day new groups spring up, still mostly in the UK, Europe and US, but also in other parts of the world. This map is actually out of date, and if you want to see the current situation, please go to the XR website or see your local group. XR's approach is modelled on civil resistance. Civil resistance, also called civil disobedience or non-violent direct action, means that citizens who are normally law-abiding start breaking rules and laws as a way to force change in a system that is refusing to change. It has been used successfully many times in the past, notably by Gandhi, who organised Indian rebellion against British rule, Rosa Parks, who famously refused to give up her seat on a bus to a white person and triggered the American Civil Rights Movement, and Martin Luther King, who organised that same movement and mobilised huge numbers of Americans to force changes to racially discriminatory laws. These people are regarded as heroes now, but at the time they were often vilified for their law-breaking and disruptiveness. So it's possible for individuals to motivate collective change by resistance against authority. XR's model of civil resistance. So the most important thing is that it's non-violent, and I'll come back to this later. It needs to involve lots of people. We need to mobilise large numbers of the citizenry of the UK and indeed of the world to rise up. It's focused where the power is. In the UK, that is London, for example, where the government is based. It needs to be disruptive in order to get people's attention, but it should be respectful. Ideally, as well, it's also creative, engaging, and fun. So now we're coming to the substance of XR's thinking. What do we want? We have three basic demands. The first is to tell the truth, for the authorities, the government and the media to tell the truth about the ecological crisis. The truth about the increasing, looming danger of climate change has been horribly watered down. For example, for a long time, the climate problem was presented as a scientific debate. So the BBC, when it had a climate scientist on to be interviewed, would often have a climate change skeptic to speak with the climate scientist in the interest of presenting both sides of the debate. However, there is really no genuine debate. Mainstream science is unanimous in its view that climate change is happening, it's happening fast, and it needs to be stopped. So we need to stop this false balance. We need people to be told the truth about what is happening. It is a really difficult truth, as you've heard. It's not nice, it doesn't make you feel good. People don't like to be told things that don't make them feel good, but that does not mean we should not be hearing it. The second demand is for the industrialised nations, including our own, to bring our carbon emissions to zero by 2025. I'll expand on that in a minute. And the third demand is for a citizens' assembly on climate and ecological justice. We will also talk on that more in a moment. So, why 2025 in particular? With regard to the speed with which carbon emissions are rising, 2025 is essentially proxy for straight away. This has been criticised as impossible, but it is what the science demands. Even if we zero our emissions tomorrow, we are going to continue warming for some unforeseeable amount of time until that excess carbon dioxide is absorbed again. We need to stop immediately. We have at present 410 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and rising. The pre-industrial baseline is 208 parts per minute, and the safe level is considered to be 350 parts per minute. "2025, as I said, is proxy for act immediately. The 2050 target is based upon the idea that we will have developed effective technologies for removing carbon from the atmosphere. We don't have such technologies now, and it is a massive risk to assume that we will. 2050, which is the government's current target for zeroing emissions, is far enough in the future that the current government does not feel much pressure to act decisively right now. 2050 amounts to kicking the problem into the long grass. People in the developing world, and increasingly the developed world, are already dying, losing their homes and livelihoods, becoming refugees. This is where I want to come back to the international response to COVID-19. The International Energy Agency has forecast the CO2 impact of the crisis, suggesting emissions could fall by 8% this year, just over the 7.6% yearly decline we need every year for the next decade if we're to stop temperatures rising by more than 1.5 degrees. We have seen governments make the most immediate and fundamental changes to our economy and lifestyle that have ever occurred outside of a wartime setting. The argument that governments can't make significant changes, that the public won't accept their way of life being changed in the face of an invisible threat, has been entirely refuted. You have seen from the first part of the talk that climate change is urgent, quantifiable, and people are suffering the consequences right now. If we can persuade governments to act in respect of climate change with the immediacy and decisiveness that they have shown in response to COVID-19, then we will be in with a good chance of winning this fight. So what do we think governments should do? One of the criticisms I've often heard about Extinction Rebellion is that it doesn't offer solutions itself. Anyone who has attended an XR meeting will know that there are people there with hundreds of ideas for changes we can make. But the reason why absolute policies aren't advocated by XR is that we believe that communities themselves are best placed to advocate for key solutions which work best for them, provided they are being advised by experts in the field. This brings us to the third demand, a citizens' assembly. So first question, what is a citizens' assembly? This is from parliament.uk website. A citizens' assembly is a group of people who are brought together to discuss an issue and reach a conclusion about what they think should happen. The people who take part are chosen so they reflect the wider population in terms of demographic, e.g. age, gender, ethnicity, social class, and sometimes relevant attitudes, e.g. preference for a small or large state. Effectively, it is a group of ordinary citizens who have been selected and brought together to consider an issue and to make recommendations to the government. So the reason for having a citizens' assembly, and the reason that this is a demand that XR has, is that it gets around some of the problems of democracy that we mentioned earlier. Citizens' assemblies are able to take the long view. Democracy is short-termist. A citizens' assembly can take that view because they're not dependent on votes. So they can sit down and say, what is it that we need to do, painful though it may be, to secure a future for our children? It may be something that completely mobilises the current economy and diverts it from all it is doing now. It may be that we need to create a wartime situation or potentially a quasi-lockdown situation where massive changes have to be made in a very short time for this particular problem. That's going to be painful, but not as painful as the alternative. So let's do that. They are free to take that long view. They are free from corporate influences. One of the problems with government is that they rely on wealthy donors, corporate donations, etc. They have to keep business happy, and that limits to some extent some of the things that they can do, particularly if you want to rein in the fossil fuel industry, which we clearly need to do. Citizens' assemblies are representative of the population and are trusted by the people for that reason. It's clear that the risk from the COVID-19 pandemic is not shared equally. And it's the same for the climate change emergency. The poorer and more marginalised you are now, the more likely you are to lose your livelihood, your home, and your life. This is why it's important that the solution comes from a full cross-section of the population, and not just those that are already wealthy and empowered. Citizens' assemblies also have a track record. They have worked very well in the past on a number of occasions. For example, Ireland called a citizens' assembly to discuss a very difficult issue of abortion that it had wrestled with for a long time. The recommendation that they made, which was to liberalise the abortion laws, was then put to a referendum, and the proportions of the votes of the people in that referendum was almost identical to those of the citizens' assembly. That was then enacted in law. So XR consider a citizens' assembly to be a very effective way of turbocharging truly democratic action on the climate emergency. I should note that a climate assembly did meet in the UK earlier this year, constituting over 100 members of the UK population. They've met 4 times already and have 2 more meetings to go before they publish their recommendations on how the UK can meet its legally binding target of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. This is definitely a good step forward. The question, though, is whether the government will pay any attention at all. There is no obligation on them to do so, and the government themselves haven't constituted the assembly, so it is not a true citizens' assembly in the way that XR is demanding. So I'm now going to talk a bit about Extinction Rebellion as an organisation and how it works. So we've discussed this before, but the most important thing about XR is that we are non-violent. And there's a lot more to non-violence than simply not being violent, not throwing things at police, etc. It's not simply pacifism or being passive. It is thoroughly assertive. We are disruptive after all. It also informs the way we think about and speak to others. Part of that is because it's the moral thing to do. We are, hopefully, moral people who don't want to cause harm. But there are also pragmatic reasons for non-violence. The state will do it better. The moment you become violent, you enable the authorities to marshal forces that could rein in that movement. In general, the state will always do violence better than any protest group. But provided the movement remains non-violent and peaceful, it's much more difficult for authorities to act because they will be perceived as being overly repressive. It is also the case that as soon as a movement degenerates into violence or chooses violence, it is likely to lose public support. So it reflects both our moral desire and our practical interests that we remain non-violent. We are decentralised. This is the second thing that's really important about XR. It's not a central organisation with a headquarters as such, although there is a notional headquarters for coordination purposes. But essentially, the way it works is that if a person is willing to sign up to the principles of Extinction Rebellion, which are laid out in full on its website, the espousal of non-violence as well as justice and fairness, etc., and they're willing to support the 3 demands, then that person can act in the name of Extinction Rebellion. So we are decentralised and self-organising. Basically the broad groups are that there are local groups. So for example, in my area of East Hertfordshire, we have XR East Herts. So that people within this area who want to join Extinction Rebellion and get involved will most likely congregate with us. We meet together regularly. There are also working groups within the local groups and some national working groups. And these are groups that convene to manage different aspects within the organisation. The main ones are action and logistics, media and messaging, arts and creative, and wellbeing. There are affinity groups, which are groups usually within the local group of 8 to 12 people, whose role it is to take actions together and support each other. And there's also some coordinating groups whose job it is to link all of those together. So it's a decentralised structure, and that means that everybody should feel equally important. It's a nice organisation to work with because you don't feel that you need to get lots and lots of layers of permission if you have an idea of something that you want to do. We recognise that confronting the ecological crisis is emotionally demanding and difficult. To retain strength to do this, we prioritise taking care of ourselves and each other, as well as the planet. This means that every expenditure of resource, be it emotional, physical, or environmental, is followed by a period of regeneration where the depleted resource is replenished. In XR, this means a focus on community building activities, art, music, talking, reflection, whatever it takes to stay strong. In the wider world, this means sustainability, not taking from the earth without recognising that at some point we need to give it back if we are to preserve a future for our generations, for our descendants. We want to take action today, but also to be fit and ready to come back and take action again tomorrow. Our core activities are actions. These are the things that aim to cause disruption and to get us to the notice of the public and to the notice of authorities. They vary from mass, highly disruptive actions, blocking streets, stopping traffic, mass arrests, to smaller, local, less confrontative, awareness-raising actions such as die-ins, funeral marches, and so on. Let's look at local actions first. For example, a common thing that local groups will do is hold a die-in, where a bunch of protesters get together in a public space and feign being dead, to make the point that what we are looking at is an existential threat to humanity, death. And people have to look at them and maybe step over them. There will be other XR people engaging those who wish to ask questions, giving them leaflets, etc. Typically it will last half an hour or so. This kind of action brings the issue to the attention of local people and maybe encourages them to join a local group. On the right, this is something that was done in St Albans recently, where a banner was hung off the clock tower. So some actions are conceived and planned nationally. Starting in April the 15th last year, groups from all over the country converged on central London and took over 4 key sites, closing roads and completely shutting down traffic. The sites were held for 10 days and the blockade generated a huge amount of media publicity. Ken Marsh, chairman of the Metropolitan Police Federation, said, "This is very, very difficult for us because my colleagues have never come across a situation that they are faced with at the moment. They are dealing with very, very passive people, probably quite nice people, who don't want confrontation whatsoever with the police or anyone else, but are breaking the law." Many public figures expressed support, including the actor Emma Thompson and the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams. This uprising in April, which lasted nearly 2 weeks, caused a huge amount of discussion and really catapulted the issue onto the public stage. In the wake of the April Rebellion, Parliament voted to declare a climate emergency, part of our first demand, on May the 1st. The awareness of the general public on these matters was greatly raised. As an example, the Facebook group for St Albans experienced a huge increase in sign-ups in the weeks surrounding the rebellion. So although a lot of people were made quite angry by the disruption, understandably, a lot of people recognise that it's necessary to be disruptive to get our voices heard. The October uprising was similar to April, but the police were better prepared and there were more arrests. Not everything went well in the October Rebellion, but the movement has been working hard ever since to learn lessons and strengthen. Now, as we have seen, disruption in many cases involves breaking the law. This is something that a lot of people have some difficulty with because most of us are law-abiding people. People who sign up to be arrested are at the heart of our actions These are people who feel this issue is of such importance that they are willing to risk reputation and liberty to advance it. They are, of course, the ones that the media discuss, and during both the April and October rebellions, hundreds of Extinction Rebellion protesters got arrested. However, for every person who is what we call an arrestable, somebody who is willing to be arrested to make this point, there are maybe 10 or 20 other people who are part of the movement who helped them get to that point, people in support, people who helped to create the artwork, to move the boat, to organise transport, all of the stuff that it takes to make this happen. The decision whether or not to risk arrest is a personal one and will have a host of factors influencing it. So you don't need to think that by joining Extinction Rebellion, you have to get arrested. You can be a support person and play just as vital a role. So how could you contribute to your time, skills and talents to XR? You could moderate a Facebook page, you could produce art, you can just go along to actions but not in an arrestable role, just to support the people who are arrestable. You can coordinate a working group, you can present a talk like I'm doing now. So there are loads of things that you can do. Of the many thousands and thousands of people who poured into London during the April and October rebellions, only a small proportion of those were actually arrestable. Most of them were people who just went along. So why should you get involved? If you're considering it, then there are some things to think about. We have presented the bleak and dismaying facts about climate and ecological breakdown. I hope we have made clear the urgency of the situation we face. My feeling is that this movement is a new and different way to fight for radical change of the kind that we need. XR and others have taken it to a whole new level. Other environmental groups have done tremendous work, but emissions, as we have seen, continue to rise relentlessly. Not doing anything is a really hard thing to justify morally. Once you confront the situation that we're in, if you do nothing, then you're accepting that what we're doing is essentially okay, but you're okay with that. A lot of us just don't feel okay with that. Positive action is therapeutic. If you are starting to grapple with this issue, it can make you quite depressed. Once you start doing something, it's amazing how much your spirits lift, because suddenly it feels like there's something that could be done and it could work. And when you start getting involved, you meet a whole bunch of people who are very similar to you. They are also moral people who care about the planet, who care about the future, have the get up and go to do something, and they're very committed and enthusiastic and warm and amazing. And then finally, it just means being on the right side of history. Despite the fact that it involves disruption, making people angry, breaking the law, I feel confident that when history looks back at the climate crisis, as I hope it will, I hope there is a future to look back at the climate crisis. I truly believe that Extinction Rebellion will be seen as a part of the turning point in that crisis. And it's good to be a part of that, and I feel very proud to be a part of that. So, how to join in? You can fill out a form or visit the website, which should now be on the slides. You can also find your local group on that website. If you're from this local area, then as we mentioned, it's Extinction Rebellion East Hertfordshire. You can join your group on Facebook, and we'll put the link to the East Hertfordshire Facebook page in the chat. And you can find out when and where their next meeting is. And then you can offer your time as little or as much as you want and share your skills. In the East Herts group, we have regular drop-in meetings now at midday on Monday and 7 PM on Thursday, which you are more than welcome to attend. And one final option is that you can email your details to the XR East Herts email address, which we'll also put in the chat. Or as John mentioned at the start of this talk, you can private message Roz on the Zoom chat. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and we're going to take any questions that anybody has. I think it's probably easiest if you put them into the chat function. And John and I will do our best to answer them. If you would like to say your chat out loud, then maybe if you can raise your hand if you're on video, or click the raise hand button if you're not on video, and John or I can unmute you.
Thanks so much, Kate. That was great. I've got one question in the chat. I think we'll just wait a minute or two to see if anyone wants to put any more in the chat, or if you would like to say your question out loud. Those of us who as Kate said, those of us who we can see, if you put your hand up, we can unmute you. Those of us who you can't see, there is a thing saying reactions down the bottom, and if you can see that there's a couple of little hands you can use there to say you want to say something. Okay. So I have one question here, which has come from Dave. I'm not sure that I fully understand it. Dave.
Hi. Yeah, it was.
Yeah. Would you like?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
My question. Well, I was struck by the fact that when you used the word unprecedented in quoting the IPCC from some years ago, obviously the word unprecedented is a very overused buzzword of the government in the corona crisis that we're currently going through.
Yeah.
And I just wonder whether there are ways that we can draw parallels between the coronavirus crisis that people have accepted, the broad population has accepted needs massive action, unprecedented action, and the slightly longer term or arguably from some people seemingly more removed crisis of the the climate crisis. Can we find ways to draw parallels between the two to the benefit of the movement? Because I was very struck as well when Kate said we need large numbers of people to rise up, and all of us who come on this call, we already feel some sort of call to action. We already feel morally obliged to some extent. And my concern is with the vast numbers of people, my neighbours in the street that I live in, probably haven't felt that call yet, but it may be because nothing's got through to them. And I appreciate that seeing the actions, the mass actions in London and other big cities may draw their attention to it. But are there, we've got to find ways to try to, a bit like Captain Tom Moore, just tapped into a zeitgeist and got the media, didn't mean to, but the media got on his side. Can we use the coronavirus as the zeitgeist, if you like, to suddenly say, geez, those guys really, we need to think about what they're saying because they're telling the truth. How do we get that through to the wider population?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, the coronavirus, it's in some sense, there's a little bit of a problem with trying to sort of leverage the coronavirus crisis to kind of try and draw the climate crisis into it, because it's a crisis and many people have suffered themselves or their relatives have suffered. So we don't want to sort of try and jump on a sort of bandwagon, I think. But at the same time, as I think we both tried to say, there are clear links between the coronavirus crisis and the climate crisis. And I suspect that it has started to open up a sort of the public in such a way that maybe they are going to be more receptive to hearing about what we are going to face. I mean, I think these three things I tried to draw out, the whole issue of vulnerability in the face of sudden these sort of changes, the issue of biodiversity and the fact that it's all, there seems to be a pretty clear link between the pressure we're putting on our environment and the the eruption of this coronavirus epidemic, and some third point I made that I can't remember at this point. But I think it maybe is creating an environment in which our message can be heard more clearly. I think maybe the public are going to be a bit more receptive. I'm not sure if that really answers your question. Kate, have you got any thoughts on that?
No, I mean, I agree with what you said, John. I think it's a bit of a difficult balance at the moment from a PR perspective, to be honest, for XR in terms of coronavirus, and clearly it's devastating, and this isn't the way that we intended the world to change. It needs to change, but a lot of people potentially being out of work in a very dramatic fashion isn't the way we want that change to be effective. And XR, the focus is very much about climate justice, but there are obviously a lot of ways that you could reduce emissions in the world that wouldn't meet the climate justice requirements. And I think some of that is what we're seeing in the coronavirus response. But the real positive takeaway, I think, is the fact that we can affect a dramatic change very quickly, and that governments are prepared to do that if they feel as though the immediacy of the danger is there. And I think the challenge now is making them feel like the immediacy of the danger is there for climate change as well.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Okay, we've got one or two more questions coming up. The next one that has come up is the map of the world showed little XR activity in Asia, especially in the former Soviet Union region. How can we make Extinction Rebellion work globally? Well, I'm not sure if this probably isn't quite what you had in mind, but you'll hear a lot of people say, when a lot of the stuff we get from Extinction Rebellion is, why don't you go to Beijing? Why don't you, we're trying to do our best here. Why don't you go and do your actions in Beijing? That's where they need it. And I think, my response to that is always our responsibility as British citizens here is to our own government. So we act here to make our, to try and influence our own government to make these changes. How can we bring this to the rest of the world? Well, I think the answer is, it is starting to happen in the rest of the world. As Extinction Rebellion is active all over the place, but certainly there are areas where we are not so active. And I think the only answer to this is that hopefully by our example, if we are successful in influencing our government, then other countries can see the potential and can start to work on their government. And I think, we do see that happening. Obviously in places like Russia, and particularly, Russia, it must be very difficult to be an activist. China, in a country that is not a democracy and where protest is just really not allowed, it's really problematic. But I think, we have to try and exert our imagination here and try and imagine what might be possible. Kate?
John, I didn't want to butt in, but I believe Kate mentioned the map's been updated on the website. And I think in the last year or so, there have been some groups popping up in Russia and and I don't know about Asia, but yeah, those groups were obviously facing harsh backlash from their dictators. But yeah, the map's constantly updating because there are more groups popping up all over the world. Yeah.
At the moment, I can't imagine how XR could start up in China. It just seems unlikely that it could be possible. But perhaps, if we can exercise our imagination, and who knows what might happen. Kate, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Entirely echo everything you've just said. I think we have to be aware of our privilege in this country, that we can partake in this kind of protest without generally risk to our lives and our livelihoods, frankly. That obviously isn't the case everywhere in the world. One of the most striking things for me during the October Rebellion was a gravestone that was put in Trafalgar Square with the names of the most recent killed environmental activists around the world. You know, activism in a lot of countries is potentially a death sentence, and I think that's all the more reason why, if we're in countries where we are free to do it, we should.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Kate. Catherine says, how do you envisage maintaining social distancing during actions, and how would the police arrest people in these circumstances? Well, Kate, do you want to try and answer that?
Yeah, so well, I see Toby has already put a partial answer in the chat, which is perfect. Thank you, Toby. So obviously, a lot of the plans which XR had for this year, as with everyone else, have been put on hold. There was due to be another rebellion around this time, which has been postponed. So it is having a dramatic impact. But there have been an impressive, I think, actually, amount of actions going on during lockdown, in particular around HS2, things like emailing the companies who are involved in that, creating kind of, I guess, electronic pressure on them. There's also been a no going back action where people were encouraged to put no going back posters on the biggest climate offenders in the high street, obviously in a socially distanced way. And there are protests going on this weekend where people are going to go on cycles in a socially distanced manner along roads where they would like there to be cycle lanes. I think things are still happening, but obviously we just need to be as creative as possible. And to, I guess, the question earlier on how much we use the coronavirus crisis, we also have to be aware of tone. John, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, obviously this is kind of something where a lot of thinking and planning and imagination is going on as we speak. You know, how do we maintain our presence as Extinction Rebellion in these very, very difficult circumstances? And, you know, how do we, as the lockdown starts to ease, if and when it does, how can we undertake protest? And all I can say, I think, is that Extinction Rebellion has got some incredibly creative thinkers in it. The ideas are coming up all the time. And also Extinction Rebellion has, I think, been very responsible. You know, I think we locked down, we cancelled protests very, very quickly when this epidemic started. And I think we have been very responsible all the way through. So I think in this, how do we protest under these conditions? All ideas are welcome. Many ideas are taking place, and we shall see as the days go on.
In relation to your point on the police, Catherine, sorry, just to come back on that one.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's fair to say that it's probably harder to have arrestable actions at this stage, because if you can't do most of the things which are illegal, then it's obviously impossible to get arrested. So I think the actions are more going to be focused on, and also I think there's a question over whether you should be putting increased pressure on the police at this point in time anyway. So I think the actions are about gaining attention more generally rather than through illegal activities. John, Lucy had a question, if it's all right for me to take that one now.
Yes, do, yes, yeah. And then there's where sorry, can I just say we've got about 7 or 8 minutes. Zoe has made a couple of points after that, which we can deal with, and then we'll just see if there's anything else. So yeah, carry on, Kate.
Brilliant. So Lucy's question is, if the People's Assembly provides recommendations, then I assume that it's not legally binding. And therefore, if we do achieve this, how can we guarantee that governments will act on it? Which is a fantastic question. And actually, the the talk talked about the abortion in Ireland and the Assembly's recommendations on that, which were taken up. What it glosses over slightly is that that particular Citizens' Assembly actually gave a whole load of other recommendations to the Irish government, which they subsequently ignored, including on climate change. And I think that is a big problem. The Citizens' Assembly, which has been constituted this year in the UK, as I said, isn't one which the government actually put in place. I think it was something like the Parliamentary Select Committees, but I may get that wrong, so don't quote me on that, who asked for it to be constituted. So there's no real buy-in from our government at all. And I think in order for the Citizens' Assemblies to work, there needs to be a legal framework around it whereby they are required, whether that is legally or through political pressure, which is again where XR comes in, that they are required to act on those recommendations. John, do you have anything to add on that?
No, I don't think I do. Thanks.
Lucy, does that answer your question? Cool.
Great. Well done. Thank you. Zoe has made a comment, I think it is really, saying, I do believe that the IBPES.net reports on COVID-19 are very important. Now, IPBES is an organisation that runs parallel with the IPCC to do with the environment and biodiversity. And I'm not familiar with their reports on COVID-19, but I guess that's a useful thing to look at. You can see see what it says in the chat. Clear scientific links made and continue to be made by respected scientists. That's the links between coronavirus and biodiversity destruction, as I was saying. And Zoe also said, can you repeat the meeting times for Extinction Rebellion East Herts? Now, I think we've said this and Toby's put it in the chat, but just so we're aware that at the moment, we are having 2 drop-in meetings a week on Zoom like this, which are just meetings where we meet up without an agenda. Those take place on Monday from 12 to 1, a daytime meeting, and Thursday evenings between 7 and 8:30. And there's always a few of us there. Anybody's really welcome to join us if you'd like to talk more about this and thinking about getting involved with us. The Zoom link for that is not the same as this meeting. You will be able to find it if you look on Facebook, or if you've given Ros your email address, or if you join our WhatsApp group, which you can join if you leave us your phone number. So those meetings, anybody is more than welcome. That's the only things we have scheduled at the moment, are these meetings. So that's the sort of place to go next. What else? So we're coming up to 9 o'clock. Okay, so is there anything else anybody would like to ask or say or comment? If you put your hand up, if I can see you, I will unmute you, or if you do a little raised hand through the reactions thing at the bottom of the screen. Otherwise, I think we'll draw to a close. Anything, Kate, you want to say, or Toby, or Ros?
No.
Ros.
Only to just remind people that if they do want to pass on their email address to me, to just send me a personal chat in the chat group. And then I'll just drop you a welcome email inviting you to our Facebook group and our WhatsApp group. It would be lovely to get more people involved locally, and, you know, again, just going back to what Kate said, in general, that can be at whatever level people like. There's no pressure. It can literally just be coming along to a meeting, or just being on the WhatsApp group and putting an occasional article that to share on the WhatsApp group or on the Facebook group or by email. You know, any level of involvement is really welcome. So if there's anybody who's not already connected with the East Herts XR group, then you know, please feel free to contact me.
I should say as well that for anybody here who isn't in the East Herts region, Ros, if it's okay, if they still want to give you your email address, and we can put them in touch with the local group for wherever they are. Or as I said, you can go on the website.
Yeah.
Yes, of course, you could be from anywhere in the world really on this chat, so on this form of interaction. So yeah, that's true. There was one more thing I was going to say, and it's gone right out of my head. What was it? Oh yeah, just to say that if you know of any group or any sort of organisation you're involved with that might like to hear this talk, we'd be very happy. And see, Kate is nodding there. I hadn't consulted her, but we would be very happy to set that up for you. Whether that's hopefully in the future in person, in a small, you know, in person, or whether it's over Zoom in the next sort of month or 2 or 3, do get in touch and we can talk about that. So it only remains to say thank you all so much for coming, for giving up 2 hours of your evening. And I hope this has been worthwhile for you. I hope it's been inspiring. I hope it's been sobering. I hope it's been thought-provoking. Thanks again for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You may now leave. Okay, bye.